The wind that swept across the Arizona frontier carried dust from 100 forgotten trails and the scent of dry sage that clung to everything it touched. When Sarah stepped down from the stagecoach at the lonely trading post, she felt as if she were stepping into another world entirely, one that did not know her past and perhaps did not care about it either. The sun hung low behind her as if it too were watching her carefully, and she forced herself to breathe through the knot tightening in her chest. She had come far, farther than she had ever expected to go in her life, and yet she still carried the same hollow ache inside her heart. Her shoes were worn and her dress had lost its prettiness long ago. Still, she walked with a quiet bravery as she approached the wooden planks of the trading post. The building was weathered and tired-looking with peeling red paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. A few horses stood tied out front, swishing their tails lazily as if they had seen every kind of traveler who wandered through these lands. No one paid attention to the thin woman stepping down from the coach, but she felt every stare that flickered her way, whether imagined or real. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not to ward off cold, but to protect herself from the memory of the life she had fled. For as long as she could remember, she had been told she was unwanted. Her aunt had taken her in only out of obligation after her parents passed, and had made sure Sarah never forgot the weight of that burden. Each day had been a reminder that she was a mouth to feed, a body to clothe, and a girl who brought nothing but trouble. She learned early to keep her voice soft, her footsteps lighter than dust, and her needs small enough to hide. But even the quietest person carries wounds that do not close, and Sarah had reached a breaking point the day her aunt threatened to sell her off in exchange for a debt owed. That threat had carved a final scar across her heart and pushed her onto the trail toward the unknown. Trading Post was supposed to be a place of beginnings, or so she hoped. The owner had written her a letter saying he needed help with bookkeeping and housekeeping, and though the pay was modest, it came with a roof and a chance to build a life for herself, a thing she had never truly had. She clutched that letter in her pocket, even now running her thumb across the creased paper as if it were the only anchor she had left. She lifted her chin and stepped inside the building, hoping to find the man who had promised her work inside. The air was thick with the smell of leatherwood smoke and the faint bitterness of strong coffee. Shelves held everything from sacks of flour to rusted tin coffee pots, and a few rifles lined the wall behind the counter. Two cowboys argued quietly over the price of ammunition while a trapper with a beard long enough to braid sorted through fur pelts in the corner. The room felt both alive and dangerously close to exploding into chaos, something Sarah sensed instinctively. She moved carefully like a deer watching shadows for hidden movement. She waited near the door, not wanting to interrupt anyone, yet too afraid to step deeper inside. Her heartbeat thumped louder with each passing second as unwanted memories crawled up from the past. People had always shouted at her for being in the way, for speaking at the wrong moment, or for simply breathing too loudly. Now she hesitated, fearing she would be scolded again. She pressed her back to the wall and tried to make herself small, but her fingers trembled against her skirt. No one noticed her except one man she did not see at first. Outside on the far edge of the trading post yard, a lone Apache warrior paused in the shadow of a cottonwood tree. His keen dark eyes followed her movements with an attentiveness that held no judgment, only curiosity. He saw the way she held herself as if expecting a blow at any moment, and the way her gaze avoided others as though she had never known safety. Something in her fragility stirred something old inside him, a memory of pain, loss, and the instinct to protect what was vulnerable. Sarah did not know it yet, but that quiet moment, her frightened steps, her weary heart, and the Apache warrior watching from a distance would shape the beginning of a story neither of them expected. In that vast rugged land where the horizon stretched forever, two lives had just brushed against fate without a single word exchanged. Dakota had not planned to linger near the trading post that morning. He had come only to trade a bundle of deer hides and gather a few supplies before riding back to his people. The land was shifting again, more settlers pushing into Apache territories, more patrols riding the trails, more danger for anyone who stayed too long in a place filled with uneasy strangers. But something held him in the shade of the cottonwood tree that bordered the dusty yard. Something that felt like a whisper carried on the wind. That whisper was Sarah. He had noticed her the moment the stagecoach rattled to a stop, all creaking wheels and snorting horses. Travelers came and went every day, some weary, some loud, some reckless. But she stepped down as though she had crawled across the desert on her knees, carrying nothing but sorrow and stubborn hope. Her eyes told the story first, wide and unsure. Holding a quiet sadness he recognized with a sharp pang in his chest, she had the look of someone who had survived too. Many storms without once finding shelter. Her dress was plain. Her shawl pulled tight around her as if it were the last shield she owned. She walked with small measured steps, careful steps, as if the world was something she had to approach with caution. Dakota had seen that walk before in children who had lost parents, in warriors wounded in spirit more than body, in women who had endured more cruelty than kindness. The world carved that posture into people, and only something gentler than fate could ever soften it again. He watched her enter the trading post, watched her pause just inside the doorway like a wild creature, uncertain whether the hands inside would feed it or strike it. She stayed close to the wall, trying to disappear, but her fear clung to her like dust in sunlight. Dakota shifted slightly, leaning against the tree trunk, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. Other men nearby ignored her, but Dakota's instincts did not know her name yet, but he felt something stir inside him. An old instinct he had buried long ago. Had been years since he allowed himself to look at anyone with anything more than passing interest. Loss had shaped his life like a river-shaped stone. His wife had died during a harsh winter, and the child she carried had gone with her. After that, Dakota's heart had become a quiet place, a place where he kept memories like dried flowers, fragile and hidden. He had sworn to himself that he would not open that part of his spirit again. The world was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too full of wounds waiting to happen, but the sight of this fragile stranger unsettled that. Oath she reminded him of a wounded doe he had once found during a hunt long before the tragedies of his life. The animal had limped into a shallow ravine with an arrow embedded in its flank, trembling with fear yet refusing to give up. He had approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, and removed the arrow before letting her run free. Sarah had that same trembling resilience, that same instinct to survive even when the world had given her no reason to believe she was worth saving. From where he stood, he could see a pair of ranch hands, lounging near the hitching post. They were drinking something strong, passing a tin cup between them while making crude jokes. Their eyes drifted toward the trading post door much too often, and Dakota knew that look. Men like that sought out people who looked lost weak alone. Sarah was all three in the eyes of hungry wolves. His jaw tightened as he watched them nudge each other, and Dakota stayed in the shadows, not stepping forward yet, but the decision was already forming in his heart. He was not a man who involved himself in the troubles of settlers. Their world was not his world, and their problems were not his responsibility. But the spirits had a way of placing certain lives in one's path for a reason, and he felt that old pull again. That quiet whisper that said this woman was important somehow inside the trading post. Sarah still clung to the wall like she expected someone to shout at her. She folded her hands in front of her skirt, her knuckles white with worry. The trader behind the counter barely glanced at her, treating her like another piece of background clutter. Dakota watched the moment she tried to gather her courage to speak. He saw her inhale deeply, lifting her head even though her fear still trembled beneath her ribs. She was trying so hard to belong, trying so hard to make herself worthy of a place in this harsh world. Something inside him softened. Wind shifted, then carrying her scent faintly toward him. Sage and dust and something tender beneath it. It brushed against him like a memory of warmth. On that breeze, a quiet truth settled on him with surprising certainty. Would not let anything happen to her today, not while he could see her, not while he could sense the trembling inside her, not while danger watched her the way hungry men watched a cornered Dakota straighten from the tree and stepped forward, letting the sun reveal him fully for the first time. He did not know what words he would speak, nor what path this choice would carve in his life. But he knew this. The story of that fragile woman with sorrowful eyes had just become part of his own, and fate had begun to tie their paths together thread by thread. The trading post was quiet for a few moments after the stagecoach had rumbled off, leaving only the low murmur of cowboys arguing over prices and the steady creak of the wooden floorboards beneath boots. Sarah clutched her shawl tighter, trying to steady her racing heart. She had not expected kindness on the frontier, nor had she imagined it would arrive in the form of a silent, watchful man she had never spoken to. Yet, every instinct she had learned over a lifetime of caution screamed that she was being observed, that someone larger, stronger, and unpredictable was standing close by. It was a drunk ranch hand who shattered that fragile calm. His boots scuffed carelessly against the boards, his breath carrying the sharp scent of whiskey, and his eyes fixed on her with unwanted familiarity. He stepped closer, leaning toward her, grinning with a confidence that had been earned by intimidation. Sarah froze, her body tense, wishing she could vanish into the floorboards, her voice lost somewhere in her throat. She had faced cruelty before, the cruel laughter of relatives, the coldness of a home that never welcomed her. But she had never faced the predatory grin of a stranger who thought her fear was entertainment. "Little lady, you look lost. Maybe I can show you around," he slurred, his hand brushing too close to her arm. She flinched and pulled back, instinct screaming at her to run. Her eyes darted around the room desperately, seeking someone, anyone, to intervene. The trader behind the counter glanced briefly but returned to his work, uninterested. It was then she saw him, Dakota, the Apache warrior who had been watching from the shadows. His presence was sudden yet quiet, like the calm before a storm. He stepped into the open space between her and the man, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Dakota's dark eyes fixed on the ranch hand with a dangerous stillness that made even the loudest cowboys stop mid-sentence. The man laughed, thinking the silent warrior posed no real threat. But Dakota did not smile, did not move hurriedly. He simply moved his hand to the edge of his knife, slow and deliberate, as if the world itself had slowed to witness the choice that had been made. "Back away from her," Dakota said, his voice low, steady, carrying authority that made the air itself tremble. The ranch hand scoffed and took another step forward. "Who's gonna make me, Apache? You?" The word rang in the room, sharp and heavy with mockery, but Dakota's gaze did not waver. He stepped just enough closer for his shadow to fall across the man, silent but commanding. Sarah felt her knees weaken, relief rushing through her veins like water after a long drought. Someone was protecting her, someone who did not need to speak much to claim control over a room full of men. She had never known such protection before, not in her home, not from family, not from anyone she had trusted. The tension was electric. Other men in the room shifted nervously, sensing that the simple act of stepping forward could ignite violence. Dakota's presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. The ranch hand, now unnerved by a force he could not read, muttered a curse and stumbled backward, unwilling to push further. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched him retreat, grateful beyond words for the quiet strength that had arrived in the nick of time after the danger passed. Dakota turned his eyes to Sarah. There was no mockery, no judgment, only a calm intensity that made her feel both small and protected at the same time. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Her lips trembled, and tears, hot and unbidden, rose in her eyes. For the first time in her life, someone had defended her without expecting anything in return. Someone had recognized her fear and met it with strength and patience rather than cruelty. He stepped closer, his presence no longer threatening but steadying, like the earth beneath her feet after a storm. She could see the faint lines of scars on his hands, the quiet wisdom in his gaze, and the kind of resilience she could not name. It was as if he had faced his own battles and had survived, and now he offered her the same chance to survive another moment unscathed. In that first collision of worlds, the frontier's harshness and the quiet power of the Apache warrior, Sarah felt something she had never allowed herself to feel. A flicker of trust. The men around them slowly resumed their tasks, though the room still hummed with tension. Sarah's breathing began to steady as she looked at Dakota. He did not speak further, did not demand her attention, but the silence itself was reassuring. He had chosen to step between her and danger, and that simple act spoke more loudly than words ever could. In that moment, a fragile connection formed, a quiet understanding that though the world had been cruel, there existed someone who could be relied upon to stand when the odds seemed stacked against her, and Sarah, who had carried a lifetime of fear and sorrow, felt a seed of something new take root. She did not yet know the shape it would take, did not yet know the trials that lay ahead, but for the first time she realized that perhaps not all men were cruel and not all worlds were designed to hurt her. Someone out there, in the wide, harsh frontier, had seen her and chosen to act, and that was the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine fully. Trading posts settled into a fragile calm after the confrontation, the echoes of scuffed boots and slurred threats fading into the dusty corners. Sarah stood near the doorway, her hands pressed against her chest as if trying to hold herself together. Her heart still thumped wildly, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark of relief glimmered. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her fear and responded with action instead of mockery. Someone had stepped forward when no one else would. She wanted to speak, wanted to say the words that had been trapped in her throat for years. But every time she tried, the syllables caught and twisted into silence. Dakota remained near her, not pressing her, not speaking unnecessarily. He had a presence that carried both strength and patience, a calmness that made the air around him feel safer. She could feel his gaze resting on her, not the kind that judges or interrogates, but the kind that observes with quiet concern. For a woman like Sarah, who had spent so long hiding, shrinking, and apologizing for her very existence, that simple attention was revolutionary. It made her cheeks burn with vulnerability, yet it drew the truth from her lips before she could stop it. I don't think anyone has ever loved me, she admitted, her voice small and fragile, cracking like thin ice over a winter river. She did not know why she said it aloud, why the words escaped in a rush, but the confession felt necessary. It was the wound she had carried silently, the shadow that had colored every corner of her life, the pain that whispered every night that she was unworthy. She had buried it deep, hidden it beneath courtesy and obedience, but now it surfaced, trembling and exposed. Dakota's eyes softened, and he did not interrupt. He did not scoff or offer empty comfort, because he understood the weight of truth when it arrives unasked. He recognized her honesty as a kind of courage, the bravery it took to finally voice a wound that had never found acknowledgement. In his people's way, witnessing a confession like hers was sacred. It was a bridge that could connect two hearts that had known sorrow and loss. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, yet not close enough to overwhelm. "Then," he said quietly, his voice low and deliberate, "let me give you what you have never received." There was no arrogance in his words, no boastful claim, only a steady offer, a promise wrapped in sincerity. It was a declaration that transcended language. It was an intention to protect, to nurture, and to honor what she had been denied. For Sarah, The words struck her in a way she had never imagined possible. They did not erase the past, but they made the possibility of a different future real. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them to her face, the tears threatening to fall, not just for fear or relief, but for the sheer weight of finally being understood. For the first time, someone had not dismissed her grief, had not called her fragile foolish, had not demanded she prove herself worthy. He had only seen her, and that seeing was revolutionary. It reminded her that she existed beyond the judgments, beyond the cruelty, beyond the harsh words that had defined her childhood outside. The wind shifted, stirring dust in lazy swirls across the trading post yard. The horses flicked their tails and snorted. The faint creak of boards and the murmur of voices filled the background, but in that room, time seemed to pause. In the fragile silence, Sarah allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time, to feel her shoulders loosen and to sense the possibility of trust. She knew nothing of the warrior's past, his battles, or his own losses, yet she sensed a bond forming, fragile but undeniable, built on mutual recognition of pain and the quiet offer of protection. I don't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling again, "how someone could care." She met his gaze finally, eyes wide and vulnerable. Dakota's expression remained patient, unwavering, a mirror of strength and quiet understanding. He did not demand her trust, but his presence invited it. The smallest smile flickered across her lips. Tentative, almost afraid to exist, yet there it was. A fragile acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, she could allow someone into her life without fear in that moment. The trading post, the desert, and the vastness of the frontier seemed smaller, as if the enormity of her isolation had finally found an answer. The Apache warrior had not merely defend. Dakota could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him, not in urgency but in the gravity of choice. He had seen countless lives unfold in the harsh desert, watched men claim what they wanted with little thought for the hearts they broke. And yet here was something entirely different, a fragile human soul laid bare, a confession that whispered of years of sorrow. And he alone stood between her and the merciless world. Sarah's words, trembling and honest, lingered in the air. "No one has ever loved me." They were simple, yet they carried the depth of every cruel glance, every harsh word. Every lonely night she had endured, he stepped closer, his shadow stretching over the worn wooden boards of the trading post. The room seemed suddenly quieter, the din of cowboys and traders fading into the background as he considered what he would say and what he would do. "Then let me give you what you have never received," he had whispered, and those words were not idle. He meant them with a depth he had rarely allowed himself to feel. They were more than a promise, they were a vow, a commitment made silently in the heart. Binding him to a path he could not abandon. Dakota understood love not as a fleeting fancy, but as an act of courage, of standing when the world sought to push someone down. He had loved and lost, and in that loss had hardened himself against the whims of fate. Yet Sarah's presence softened the edges of his heart in ways he did not expect. She was a reminder that life could still be tender, that loyalty and care were not weaknesses but shields. He would protect her not because it was expected, not for honor or reputation, but because it was right. Because for the first time in a long while, he could offer something meaningful to someone who had been denied. I've knelt slightly to meet her gaze, letting the lines of his face scarred, weathered, and resolute speak for the promise in his soul. His dark eyes held no judgment, only recognition. "I will stand for you," he said quietly, his voice like low thunder rolling across distant hills. "I will be here when danger comes, when fear rises, when you think no one sees you." He let the words hang between them, heavy but steady, offering safety not just for her body but for the tender corners of her heart she had kept hidden. Sarah's eyes widened. a mixture of disbelief and hope stirring within her. She had spent her life believing the world was a place where kindness was fleeting and love was a lie. Every man she had known had used her, ignored her, or dismissed her existence. To hear someone vow care and protection without expectation shook her to the core. Her lips trembled, her chest rising and falling as though she had been holding her breath for decades without knowing it. For the first time, someone had not only seen her pain but had pledged to honor it, to meet it with strength and tenderness outside. The wind swept across the trading post yard, carrying the scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth. Horses flicked their tails, indifferent yet present, witnesses to a moment heavier than the world outside. Dakota remained kneeling, patient, steady, letting Sarah feel the power of his vow without pressuring her into understanding it all at once. Love, he knew, could not be rushed. Trust, like water through a desert canyon, took time to carve a channel deep enough to sustain life. And he would wait, would guard, would persist until she could finally believe that someone could care so fully. The faintest smile brushed Sarah's lips, tentative and fragile, but real. She dared to lean just slightly toward him, feeling the solidity of his presence, the promise wrapped in his eyes. She did not yet know how this new bond would unfold, what trials the frontier would throw in their path, or what danger might arrive next. But she felt, for the first time, that she was not entirely alone. That someone, a warrior with scars and strength in equal measure, had vowed to stand beside her in a world that had long been unkind. Dakota rose slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, signaling that the vow was not fleeting but enduring. He extended a hand, not as a gesture of command but of partnership, and Sarah, trembling yet determined, placed her own within it. In that simple contact, a bridge was formed between two worlds: the harsh, untamed desert and the fragile human heart, the lonely woman and the warrior who had chosen to protect her. In that instant, a story began, one shaped by courage, trust, and the quiet power of a vow made not in words alone, but in the steadfast promise to stand when all else failed. The next morning, Dakota led Sarah out of the trading post and into the vast expanse of the desert, where the sun burned gold across the mesas and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant pine. The land was harsh, wide, and unforgiving, yet it held a strange kind of beauty that few outsiders ever noticed. For Sarah, every step on the sandy trail was a mixture of fear and awe. She had spent her life trapped in cramped rooms, hiding from cruelty and disappointment. And now she found herself walking beside a man who promised protection. Venturing into a world entirely unknown to her, Dakota rode with a calm, deliberate pace, his horse moving like it had learned the rhythm of the land from generations of Apache riders before him. Sarah struggled to keep up at first, her own horse unsteady and skittish, her body sore from hours of sitting and gripping the reins. Yet Dakota did not hurry her, did not chide her for stumbling. He simply moved at her pace, glancing back every so often to ensure she was safe, a silent sentinel in the wilderness. With each passing mile, Sarah felt the fear that had always clung to her begin to loosen, replaced by a cautious curiosity and a fragile sense of trust. As they rode deeper into Apache lands, Dakota began to teach her the ways of the people and the land. He showed her how to read the tracks of animals in the sand, how to recognize signs of water, and how to move quietly so as not to disturb the desert's delicate balance. Sarah absorbed these lessons with wide-eyed wonder. She had never known such a connection to the earth, never felt so aware of the world around her. With every lesson, a sense of belonging started to blossom within her, one she had thought impossible. Here, in this untamed land, she could exist as herself without the weight of scorn or rejection pressing down on her. They made camp beside a narrow stream that wound through a rocky canyon. Dakota showed her how to gather firewood, how to start a fire without striking a match, and how to cook a simple meal that nourished both body and spirit. Sarah watched him, fascinated by his knowledge and patience, realizing that this man had lived through more hardships than she could imagine, yet still carried a heart capable of generosity. By the firelight, she felt the first inklings of safety, a rare and precious feeling she had been denied all her life during long rides and quiet evenings. Sarah began to share fragments of her past, the memories she had kept locked away for fear of judgment. Dakota listened without interruption, without criticism, offering only understanding and the occasional nod that said he acknowledged her pain. She spoke of her cruel relatives, of the betrayals and dismissals that had defined her early years, of nights spent crying herself to sleep when no one noticed or cared. Each story she told lightened the weight inside her heart, the burden of solitude and sorrow lifting ever so slightly in return. Dakota shared his own stories, but only pieces lessons learned in the harsh desert, the losses that had shaped his resolve, the quiet wisdom passed down by his elders. Through these exchanges, Sarah began to see that trust was not a gift lightly given, yet it could grow slowly, nurtured by patience, action, and respect. She realized that this warrior, whose presence had once intimidated her, was now a guide, a protector, and a teacher of both survival and the unspoken language of care. The nights in the Apache lands were especially profound. Stars blanketed the sky in brilliance she had never imagined, and the quiet of the desert was deep and soothing. Dakota would sit beside her by the fire, not speaking much, but his gaze was ever watchful, alert to the slightest sound. Sarah felt a rare peace settle over her, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the fear that had always shadowed her life. In those hours, she felt that maybe she could belong somewhere. Maybe she could be seen and valued, and maybe, just maybe, love was not as impossible as she had once believed. By the time they reached the outskirts of Dakota's village, Sarah had begun to change. She walked taller, breathed freer, and carried herself with a quiet confidence. The desert had taught her resilience, and Dakota's presence had shown her that protection and care could exist without strings attached. The journey through Apache lands had been more than a passage across miles of rugged terrain. It had been a journey into trust, understanding, and the delicate first stirrings of a heart opening to the possibility of love. For Sarah, the frontier was no longer just a place of danger, but a place where hope could take root and grow. The Apache village lay nestled in a sheltered valley, the rugged cliffs around it casting long shadows across the brush and the scattered huts. Sarah had begun to feel at home here, the rhythm of life slower, gentler, and more connected to the land than anything she had known. Dakota had introduced her to his people, who, after an initial cautious curiosity, had welcomed her with quiet respect. She learned to cook simple meals over open fires, to braid her hair the Apache way, and to follow the patterns of the sun and stars. For the first time in her life, she felt a fragile belonging, a sense that she was seen, valued, and in small ways loved. And yet the past, as it always does, had a way of reaching forward to remind her of the world she had fled. The quiet of the valley was shattered one late afternoon when the dust rose on the horizon. A group of men rode hard, the glint of rifles catching the sun, and the smell of malice carried on the wind. Sarah's stomach tightened as her memories surged, memories of cruel relatives, of being used and discarded, of men who had believed they could take what they wanted without consequence. She froze, heart pounding, as recognition struck. Among the riders was the ranch hand who had threatened her at the trading post. He had returned, and he had brought others with him, men who had no respect for her, no regard for Dakota, and no fear of the wilderness. Their intent was clear, and it chilled her to the bone. Dakota's eyes narrowed as he noticed them, the muscles along his jaw tightening in silent fury. He had anticipated that danger could follow, but the immediacy of it, the closeness of the threat, made his protective instincts surge. Sarah saw him shift his stance, his hands brushing over the hilt of his knife, and in that moment she realized that his vow was not idle words, it was a promise forged in action. He would defend her with everything he had, and he would do so without hesitation. Her fear did not diminish, but it was tempered by a flicker of hope. The knowledge that she was not alone, the men approached the village, shouting and brandishing weapons, their anger and arrogance carrying across the valley. Dakota moved to stand between Sarah and them, his presence commanding and unyielding. "This woman is under my protection," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying over the clamor. The ranch hand sneered, thinking to intimidate him with threats, but Dakota did not flinch. He had faced greater dangers, deeper threats, and this moment, like all the others, would not break him. His people began to gather, silent and watchful. Ready to defend the one who had been placed in their care, a tense standoff unfolded. Dust swirling around boots and horses, the wind carrying the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Sarah's hands trembled, not from fear alone but from awe at the quiet courage displayed by the man she had come to trust. Dakota did not strike immediately. He waited, measured, letting the intruders feel the weight of the resolve that surrounded them. Finally, with a precise movement and a warning glance, he disarmed the first man with a strength that spoke of years of survival and mastery over his body. The others hesitated, realizing that this was no ordinary woman to be taken lightly, no ordinary man to be intimidated by the time the conflict ended. The men had fled, cursing and defeated, the echo of their anger fading into the canyon. Sarah sank to her knees, shaking, relief flooding through her as the threat vanished like a shadow at noon. Dakota knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You are safe now," he said softly, but the words carried more than reassurance, they carried truth. For the first time, she had experienced protection that was absolute, unwavering, and selfless. She realized that his vow was not just about guarding her body, but about honoring her spirit, about showing that someone could care without expectation or demand in the quiet aftermath. As the village settled back into its routine and the sun dipped toward the horizon, Sarah allowed herself to breathe fully. The terror that had gripped her moments before began to fade, replaced by a growing understanding that courage and love could coexist. Dakota remained near her, silent but vigilant, a constant reminder that she no longer had to face the world alone. That day she learned that love and protection could be fierce, that trust could be earned through action, and that even the shadows of the past could be met with strength and honor. In that valley, surrounded by wind, stone, and the quiet wisdom of the Apache people, Sarah's heart began to open in ways she had never imagined. The sun rose slowly over the Apache village, spilling golden light across the mesas and bathing the desert in a warmth that felt like a promise. Sarah sat on a flat rock near the stream, letting the water ripple past her fingers, the events of the previous days replaying in her mind. She had survived the confrontation with the ranch hand. She had learned the ways of this land, and she had come to trust a man who, until recently, had been a stranger. Dakota had kept his vow, protecting her body and her heart, guiding her through danger and teaching her the rhythms of life in a place that had once seemed endless and merciless. And now, for the first time, she felt a fragile peace. She turned her gaze to the horizon where the wind rippled the desert grass and the distant mesas stood like silent sentinels. In the quiet moments before the village fully awakened, Sarah realized something she had never allowed herself to feel before: hope. Hope that she could be loved, truly seen, and valued. Hope that the world did not have to be cruel. Hope that her heart, long closed and scarred by years of neglect and suffering, could open again. Her lips curved in a small, almost shy smile, and for the first time, the possibility of joy did not feel like a Dakota approached from the village path, his horse moving with quiet ease. He dismounted and walked toward her, his boots making soft impressions in the dusty ground. There was a lightness to his step that had not been there before, as if the trials of the past days had forged a bond between them stronger than fear, stronger than solitude. He stopped a few feet away, lowering his gaze to meet hers. The familiar intensity in his dark eyes had softened, tempered by something deeper. Warmer, a quiet affection that had grown in the space between danger and trust. Sarah felt her breath catch as he knelt beside her, the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat brushing the top of her shoulder. She could see the faint scars on his hands, the muscles hardened by years of survival, and yet there was tenderness in the way he reached for her. "You are safe," he said, his voice carrying a calm certainty that had become a lifeline to her. "Not just from others, but from the loneliness you've carried all these years. I will not let that touch you again." His words were simple, but the promise beneath them was monumental, sweeping away years of doubt, fear, and sorrow. For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert wind whispered through the valley, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, the sounds of the village waking slowly, the distant call of a hawk circling above. Sarah's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of emotion she had bottled for so long. She reached for Dakota's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as though the land itself had carved a place for them to connect. The warmth of his hand, solid and unyielding yet gentle, sent a shiver through her, a confirmation that the bond between them was real, tangible, and undeniable. Taka lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles, and Sarah felt the last remnants of her fear and doubt slip away. She realized that love did not always arrive in grand gestures or sweeping words. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in steady protection, in understanding glances, in the courage to stand for someone when the world would rather let them fall. She had never been loved like this before, and in that moment, she allowed herself to believe that she could be they. Spent the rest of the day walking through the village and the surrounding hills, Dakota showing her the hidden paths, the places where wildflowers grew against all odds, and the spots where water pooled in quiet serenity. Sarah laughed quietly for the first time in years, the sound blending with the wind and the birdsong. Every step, every lesson, every shared silence deepened their connection, weaving their lives together with threads stronger than fear, cruelty, or past pain. The frontier, which had once been a place of peril and loneliness, had become a land of renewal, of trust, and of love. As the sun dipped below the mesas, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, Sarah and Dakota stood side by side, looking out over the valley that had become their shared world. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and he wrapped his arm around her, a quiet vow of protection renewed in the fading light. For Sarah, the woman who had once believed no one would ever love her, the impossible had arrived. In the Apache warrior, in the vast frontier, and in the courage they had both shown, she had found a love forged in danger, trust, and the healing power of care. In that moment, beneath the endless sky, her heart finally understood that she was seen, cherished, and profoundly, irrevocably loved.